Hello, this is Lita Downs from the Center for Faculty Excellence, and I would like to welcome you to today's recording, Trauma-Informed Care in Higher Education. This offering is part of the Summer 2020 National Faculty Meeting Breakout Series. On the line today, we have Dr. Candace Brown Adams. Dr. Adams is a faculty member in the Richard W. Riley College of Education and Leadership. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Adams. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for allowing me to share with you today. I'm very excited to be presenting about this particular topic. So just a little bit about me before we get going into the presentation. I've been a teacher for 24 years. I taught English and journalism in high school. I've been in the faculty for the last 14 years. As Lita indicated, in the College of Education. So I help master's level students, and I'm also a dissertation coach and mentor. I am an empath and an ordained minister very, very recently, within the last year. But some important things to know about me is that I remember trauma in my childhood, about my childhood. I wrote my dissertation about that trauma. And the trauma was emotional abuse, it was neglect, and domestic violence, those sorts of things. But a year ago, about 15 months ago, I remembered significant trauma. That had to do with sexual abuse by my father, starting at 2 years old, all the way up until the time I was 16, when there was a final sexual assault and pregnancy by him. So those things really, of course, impacted me, and they were devastating, as most trauma is. But they also led me to this place in front of you in order to support universities, faculty, and staff about trauma-informed practice. So I am so excited to be with you today. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about what trauma is. Trauma is an emotional response to a disturbing, destructive, or, as I said, devastating event. I have looked at lots and lots of research, and to me, I feel like trauma always causes harm. It is emotional harm, it is physical, it is mental, and it is spiritual. So devastating and harmful. Next slide, please. So what are some examples of trauma that you're familiar with? And I'll be talking a little bit about them, and be thinking about your own examples of trauma and maybe where they would fit. So to me, emotional trauma has to do with our feelings, something that hurt us from a feeling standpoint. And I think that most of us, when we think of trauma, we actually think of that emotional trauma. So it is, for me, the result of an extraordinarily stressful event. It can shatter your sense of security. It makes you feel incredibly helpless in a very, very, very dangerous world with dangerous people. For me, physical trauma refers to physical injury, somebody putting their hands on you, harming you in some way, shoving you, pushing you. It can be bullying also. So that might be emotional and physical trauma. Mental trauma is slightly different in that your mind shuts down and it forgets to protect itself. So for me, I remember parts of my childhood, right? Parts of it, but I couldn't remember that final act of rape, sexual assault, pregnancy. It took me 36 years and just somebody asking me if it happened to remember. Nobody had ever asked me before, and so I never answered, right? All it took was the question, and then it brought me right back to a vortex, to thinking and remembering very vividly what had happened. Spiritual trauma, for me, is the feeling that God is dead. that you're all alone. It could be your higher power. It could be just something inside of you, but that you are alone and nobody cares about you. From a spiritual trauma, it could have to do with your church or the clergy. It could have to do with the people. It could have to do with not telling about what somebody did to you in a spiritual context. Somebody that you trust. It could be somebody at school, a spiritual or a parochial school. It could be a church camp. It could be a youth group. Any of those sorts of things where you have entrusted somebody to help you with a spiritual aspect, and that somehow they have violated that. So that is spiritual trauma. Next slide, please. Okay, so some examples of traumatic events. Natural disasters. So that would be fire, earthquake, tornado, hurricanes, so many things that have happened in the last year or so are natural disasters, things that we just can't do anything about. We have no control over. We know that traumatic events are physical or sexual assault. I would also say for our military people, it would be exposure to the acts of war and or terrorism. And I think that terrorism can also be terrorism in this place where we live. We've seen so much of that, and really racial issues, racial imbalance, those sorts of things. While I wouldn't call them terrorism, I would say that they are acts of violence. So if you're watching those from a child standpoint on television, or if you've been in those situations before, or it's actually outside your front door, that is going to be traumatic. Anytime you're involved in an accident, whether it be a car accident, a diving accident, anything workplace, that is going to be a traumatic event. Certainly domestic violence is traumatic. If there's a loved one that has died, especially if it's related to an accident or an illness that's very quick, that is incredibly traumatic. Divorce can be traumatic as well for children. COVID-19, which is completely changing the way that we think about things, the way that we do things, that also can be incredibly traumatic. It is something that is putting us off balance. One thing to know, and it's been my experience and through the research, is that trauma is different for every single person. Not everybody responds to the same thing in the same way. So for example, for me, COVID-19 was not that traumatic. And it's not that for me, it wasn't upsetting and all of those things, definitely. As an empath and somebody that feels deeply, it was very, very difficult to see so many people suffering. But from the standpoint of the actual event, it wasn't that traumatic for me because I had already lived through a state of unrest. I had grown up that way. So to me, it was very easy just to maneuver those things because that's what I'm good at, right? That's what I've been taught to do. So that's just one example. For other people, COVID-19 and also I work from home. So there wasn't a whole lot of change for me. It was the same thing. For other people, it was incredibly challenging. For frontline workers, for people in healthcare, any of those things, hospital care, social work, I mean, very different. EMTs, it could be traumatic. There were so many people that needed their help. So it's different for everybody. Next slide, please. Some unsettling statistics are that 60% of adults report experiencing abuse or some other traumatic family circumstance during childhood. This is before COVID-19. So over 60%, over half of the people say there was something that was abusive in my home or incredibly traumatic during my childhood. And to me, that is just, it is absolutely unacceptable that this is happening to our children and to us as we grow up. 26% of children will witness or experience a traumatic event before they are 4 years old. So for me, I was 2 when I started being abused by my father sexually, right? So I'm 55, so that's a long time that my body and my brain and my emotions and my spirituality have had to decide what to do with this trauma and how to live with this trauma. Interestingly enough, these statistics are from the most current statistics. There's nothing out there quite yet about COVID-19. Some of these statistics are back from June, so that was the closest I could get to thinking about what's happened to us and to frame it in the most current way. Next slide, please. So we're here, we are teachers, we are faculty members, we're across the board at Walden. And what does trauma-informed care in education mean? In the research that I've done, there's lots and lots of information about trauma-informed care in medical work, in when it comes to social work, when it comes to those sorts of helping professions, and even in K through 12. But it doesn't really identify trauma-informed care when it comes to higher education. So for us, it is just assuming that more likely than not, and we'll go back to that statistic, 60% of the people that we meet, or everybody, has had some sort of trauma, and we're going to act accordingly. So to me, that means as a teacher, as a dissertation mentor, chair, committee member, what does that mean? And what I've learned through my own experience, through trainings, through being hurt by people's reactions sometimes or being helped, I've gleaned that really what we as survivors need, people that have experienced trauma, is that we want somebody really to focus on us, right? Focus on that person. To recognize that every person and their trauma is completely different. So again, for some people that COVID-19, I mean, they spiraled and they just, that was just, it shook their world. But to me, even though it was upsetting and worrisome, I felt like I had been through so much and it was all coming at one time. I could only focus on this thing, which was healing from this trauma that was in my face every day. The other thing I could put to the side. So trauma is different for everybody. As we go into talking with people, students, others, the perception in the past has been, well, what's wrong with you? For me, it was from my family, from my mom, from my sister. Well, why didn't you remember? And they wanted me to prove it, prove that this happened. And for the life of me, I just couldn't do it. I could not tell them times and dates and places. They wanted that. They wanted like a picture, and I didn't have that. I only knew what I knew. Also, that sense of what's wrong with you, that proving, right? And the idea that even though my mom and my sister did not like my father, right? My parents were divorced, and nobody ever got along because of a variety of reasons. They could believe that he could do all of these things, threaten to kill us, mental abuse, substance abuse, be cruel and vicious. They could believe all of those things, but they couldn't believe that he had done that. And so that to me was re-traumatization. It really just, that's what got me. So when we're thinking about others in trauma-informed care in higher education, I would say that not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And finally, the green part is the Candace part. When somebody comes to me, it's about, I'm so sorry. How can I help? Sometimes, and I was very good at this in the beginning, oh no, I'm fine. You can't help me at all. But as time went on, I realized if somebody offers to help and I need the help, I probably should take it. And I started being a lot better about that. Sometimes helping could be listening. Sometimes helping could be an extension on an assignment for a couple of days. Sometimes it could be additional support. So really the willingness of somebody to say, I want to help is paramount for people that have suffered trauma. Next slide, please. So trauma can impact brain development. It impacts school performance, definitely. It impairs our learning. It creates emotional and physical distress, and it leads to significant health issues. Next slide, please. So our students, the folks that we work with and care for and that care for us, are going to come to us 60% and probably more, sometimes 100%, depending on who's in our class. They're going to come in and they're going to have a lot of different feelings. They're going to be in denial, which I was. They're going to be very angry at one point, sometimes fearful, very sad, or most of my life I was just pretty numb, right? I just didn't want to have any feelings. There's a lot of shame and confusion, anxiety, depression, guilt, lots and lots of hopelessness. I still feel that way sometimes. What's the point of getting up? And been married for almost 25 years. I have a 14-year-old daughter and a dog and a job and all of those things. And so I get myself up, but it can be easy to go back to that. Who cares about what I say? Why does it make a difference? Nothing's going to change. So that hopeless feeling. Lots of irritability, as my family can attest. And you're going to have difficulty concentrating for sure, because you're constantly thinking about this thing that you don't want to think about anymore. Next slide, please. There's so many physical signs. Some research says that predominantly they're headaches, lots of digestive system things, which I always had a stomach ache and I never knew why. I was exhausted, but yet at the same time, super hyper aware. So a lot of times I would have a racing heart. I would feel very, very jumpy, agitated, and I just didn't know why. Next slide, please. So how do we, if we're faculty members, if we're staff members, support, how do we help students while maintaining our standards? What is it that we're supposed to do to help? But at the same time, we want to move people forward. That's our jobs, right? To support or to move people forward. So the first idea that came to mind is about compassion, that we want to be empathetic. We want to listen to students and hear what they have to say. The second thing is about support. We want to give them support and different resources. And again, I am not a counseling. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a licensed therapist. I'm not a social worker. And even if I did do that, in my capacity, I'm a faculty member, and so I'm not able to give out any kind of medical advice. I do not do that. But what I can do is I can refer people to maybe resources at Walden that can help them to get additional support. One thing that we want to do, though, is we want to make sure that we hold our students, people, ourselves accountable. And so we don't want students to get into a victim complex. And that is when somebody begins to believe that they're constantly the victim of these harmful actions. Even if they're made aware that that is not the truth, they're still going to say, oh yes, that is true. Some people, students, refuse to accept responsibility for dealing with their problems. They are going to find reasons why suggested solutions will not work. They carry grudges, they don't forgive, they cannot move on. But most often, I feel like they're just rarely assertive. They just can't express. Alrighty, so in review, how are we going to help those students that are in trauma, and how are we going to maintain the standards of Walden? So I would say again, as a review, compassion, support, and then that accountability. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so what do we do if a student is re-traumatized or if they're in the middle of trauma? My recommendations and what research supports is that, first of all, you want to make sure that the student feels safe. You allow them to be heard. So sometimes it might be listening to their story for a bit of time. For me, I can't say how long, but I would allow them to talk for as long as they need to without repeating themselves. But if you allow the student to be heard, then that is always a really good thing. I try to listen without fixing the problem. So I will say, I just listen, I process, and then from there, I allow the student to produce their own solutions. So for example, if it has to do with a assignment, getting back on track, I would ask the student, what would you like me to do to support you? What ways to get back on track with one assignment or two assignments or what have you? Not 8 of them, but 1 or 2. I would also provide resources and help for the student. Again, I'm not a licensed professional. I always say that. I'm not a licensed professional in this area. So here are some resources. Here's a place to go. Excuse me, at Walden. These folks that's their business, and they're going to help you. I then would hold students accountable. So for example, if they say, I need an extra 2 days, then you're going to say, that's absolutely fine. You give them 2 days, and if it's without penalty, that's okay. I'm for that. But then you check in and you hold them accountable. And then maybe the next week, you're going to check in and ask, how are you doing? How can I help? Is there anything that I can do for you? Okay, next slide, please. So as we think about going forward, how can we build a community of support? I would say that exactly what we're doing now, which is talking with one another, sharing that information across disciplines, additional research and conducting of research, sharing experiences about what works, what works for me, what are some things that haven't worked. I would say if you could make one small change during each class, during each encounter that supports trauma-informed education, maybe it's just listening, maybe it's extending support, maybe it is ability, then that alone is going to change so much in a positive way. I would say tell one person about trauma-informed education and how you support students with trauma. And then finally, I'd say take care of yourself because we need you. Self-care is really important for those people in the helping professions. And if you are not around, you can't help. Next slide. So if you have any questions about this particular webinar, I would love to hear from you. Candice.adams@mail.waldenu.edu. And I'd like to thank you so much. You are the miracle. I am so happy to be here talking with you and sharing with you about this really, really very important topic. So I am going to sign off. Our resources are at the end, and thank you so much for your participation, and have a wonderful day.